How's it going, everybody? It's Riley's Redzone here, back with another Redzone's roster previews episode, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at the Cincinnati Bengals. You can see all the previous episodes in this top corner here, if you didn't get a chance to see them, and in this series, I rank every single NFL team, so this is number 27, so I go from worst to best, and I look at every single player from the team, and I predict whether they will make the roster, make the practice squad, or be cut. And then after that, we take a look at their schedule. I predict how many wins they could get, and then I give out awards to players who fit that category. So, with that being said, let's get right into talking about the Cincinnati Bengals. I always like to start with the coaching staff just a little bit. Specifically, I like to talk about the head coach of every team, and Zac Taylor has to be on the hot seat. I mean, he has not been good. Now, I know that they did not have Joe Burrow for a large majority of last year, so that is understandable. But I do think that he is on the hot seat. I didn't love that hire when it first happened. I think just because he was the offensive coordinator under McVay doesn't mean he was going to have guaranteed success, and I think that's what we've seen so far. He hasn't necessarily proved that he can be an elite head coach, and you might, give him a little bit more time with Burrow, perhaps. But with what we've seen over the past few years, I don't necessarily think he is anything close to Sean McVay and could very well be on his way out pretty soon. So I do think it is a make-or-break-it year for Zac Taylor and the Bengals organization, as you want to take advantage of Joe Burrow here on a rookie contract. So, speaking of Joe Burrow, let's jump into the quarterback position. He played pretty well last year when he was healthy. He did get hurt with a significant knee injury. It seems as though he's going to be all good to go for this year. It happened early enough, and that's good because they need him desperately. I'm not a fan of the depth they have behind him, but I truly think Joe Burrow will be able to play pretty well this year. I think people have been jumping on the Justin Herbert hype train because he did win the Rookie of the Year, and he had a great rookie season. But let's not forget about Burrow, who's coming back. I think he can be as good, if not maybe even better than Herbert is. So I truly think that he's kind of under the radar a little bit right now. He does pretty much everything. If he can play even close to what he did at LSU, and he was decent last year, he has a lot of skills, a decent arm, throws over the middle well, can throw with no hesitation, and also good at leading his receivers. And they did bring some familiar faces from his time at LSU here, so I do think he has all the weapons around him to succeed. It's truly going to be about this offensive line because that was the problem last year, and we'll talk about that position in a bit. That is going to make or break this entire season for the Cincinnati Bengals because they need Joe Burrow healthy. Otherwise, we're going to have last year all over again, and I honestly was shocked they even won as many games as they did last year without Joe Burrow, because I am not a fan of what they have behind him. Brandon Allen, they brought him in because of the familiarity with Zac Taylor. He was there with him in Los Angeles. Now, I understand they tried Ryan Finley, and he didn't play very well. They ended up trading him this offseason. But I would have rather had them try and stick with him and see what you had there versus Brandon Allen. He did play relatively well for a backup. I'm shocked he still is even in the league, really. So I didn't necessarily think that he was great, and so I don't feel incredibly confident if Joe Burrow were to ever go down again. So you truly are just hoping that this offensive line can stay healthy, and so can Burrow with what they have. And behind them, they do have a few younger guys. Kyle Shermer has bounced around a little bit. He's just going to be a practice squad level player. at the best. And then Eric Dungy, I really liked coming out of Syracuse a few years ago. It feels like I haven't seen that name in a while. But he has been out of the league for, at this point, I think close to 2 years. So they casually just bring him back in, and so I don't think he will make the team. So I love Burrow. I truly think that by the end of this year, he could be a top 10 quarterback easy. Maybe even put himself above Justin Herbert, perhaps. I'm not saying that's a guarantee, but it's definitely possible. But behind him, you don't feel incredibly confident. So it's the same thing as last year, where if Burrow were to go down, you are not looking good. So you truly need Burrow to stay healthy, but if he is, you're going to look pretty good on offense. Then looking at the running back position, pretty interesting group here. Starting with Joe Mixon, who I think is another underrated player. I do think he can be an every down back. Same situation as well. I don't love the depth behind him, so you are looking for him to be elite. I think he is a decent fantasy option. I talk a little bit about fantasy football on this series. He should have this backfield all to himself. If he can stay healthy, same situation, I think that he can be pretty good. And he does well in the receiving game, does well just running with the football. I truly think he is a very, very good running back. Not an elite one, but very, very good. So you feel really good if he is healthy there. Behind him, you have Samaje Perine, who is more of a power player, not going to do a whole lot for you in the receiving game. We'll see if maybe he could be involved in the goal line. I don't feel great about him having to be a startable player. So luckily for them, if Mixon stays healthy, he can be a lead back and just control this backfield. But behind him as well, they bring in Chris Evans from Michigan. And he could be an interesting depth piece. See what you have there. Because a few years ago, they hit twice. They tried to see what they had with Travion Williams and Rodney Anderson in the 7th round. I think it was for both of them. And Rodney Anderson didn't work out with the injuries. They ended up cutting him. Travion Williams is still on this team. I have him barely making the roster, so he's definitely on the cut list. Like, you could switch him out with Pookie Williams because he has not done a whole lot for you in his time here. But I do think they bring in Chris Evans for that reason, just to try somebody else. They're looking to get a solid backup behind Joe Mixon. So the rotation is not great, in my opinion, there, but you do like Mixon as a lead back. He can do it all. Then they bring in Pookie Williams as an undrafted free agent out of Kansas. Underrated player. I thought he would be drafted in the end of the draft. He did not. So it's a good pickup, and he could honestly compete for that number 4 running back spot for sure. And then I have them cutting Jaquiz Patrick. So as I said, Joe Mixon, stud, great player, can do almost everything for you, but behind him, you're kind of lacking in this rotation. Then at the wide receivers, this is an elite group, in my opinion. I think it is completely depth-filled. You have a lot of great options here, a diverse set of skills. It's really, really looking good for this wide receiver room. Now, I was very, very split in the draft at number 5 on whether they should take Jamar Chase or Penei Sewell in the long term. I don't think it's going to be a huge difference. I do think that I had Penei Sewell a little higher than I did have Jamar Chase, but in 10 years, I think we'll be looking at both players being very, very good. And so I can understand if they went out and at least picked a tackle or a guard. He might play both. We'll talk about that later in the 2nd round. That gave you, at least some security. Because Jamar Chase can be really good. I was kind of in the minority where I actually had him as my number 2 receiver behind Devontae Smith. And a lot of people may question that. But I personally think they both are really, really good, and it depended on which team was picking between. Because what Jamar Chase is going to be really good at, which is what this team needed, and I specifically said, if you're the Bengals, you need an X receiver. You're losing A.J. Green, and you need a physical guy who can go up and get it and run routes really well. You already had some speed. You have your slot guy. So in this situation, it made sense to go with Jamar Chase, because what he's going to offer is great run after catch ability, great jump ball ability. I don't think his deep speed is incredibly well, but if there was any quarterback that could unlock it, I think it's going to be the connection with Joe Burrow, so I do like that a lot. So I really think he's exactly what this team needed. They needed a alpha, just dominant player, and I do think Chase will offer more of that than any other receiver in this draft. So I think it was a solid choice, and he's going to be an immediate impact and perhaps a number one wide receiver right away. But they also have great options with Tyler Boyd, who to me can be their slot guy at this point. He's a very startable player, and they have other players that are also really, really good. So I do think that Tyler Boyd still can perform really well. You have three guys here who I don't think they will all get over like 900 yards, but I could easily see any of them going for 1,000 on a given year. Obviously, with them together, you're not going to get a individual strength season, but combined, this is an elite receiver room and has to be one of the best trios, because not only do they have Tyler Boyd, then behind him they have T. Higgins, who has performed really, really well. He did great as a rookie, and I think he will only continue to step it up. So he fills, some of that void that's left from A.J. Green leaving. And so this trio is very, very, very good. Just the skill sets. Like I said, Chase can be your dominant X guy. You have your slot guy with Tyler Boyd, and T. Higgins can just be a speed deep threat who also runs great routes. So you truly have an elite wide receiver core. And not only that, they have Auden Tate, who is another physical player, not quite as dominant, but a physical player who performed relatively well in 2019, dealt with, I think, some injury issues last year, didn't get on the field, but he offers something to the table as well in the physical game. And then they bring in Trent Taylor, who the 49ers decided to let go. I think that's a great pickup. I still think Trent Taylor is a borderline startable slot receiver in the NFL. So they can bring him in the slot as well. And it looks like he might actually be one of the favorites for some return ability as well. So he can be involved both in special teams and in this offense. So I do think that was a great pickup. And behind that, they have Mike Thomas. Not Michael Thomas, but a different one who they brought in because of his connection with the Rams back with Zac Taylor. And he can offer something on special teams. So this wide receiver room might be one of the best in the league for sure. I absolutely love it, and within another year or two as well, these guys are only going to be better. So this is absolutely great. I do have Stanley Morgan being my practice squad receiver, has performed relatively decent when given opportunities. And then I have them cutting Trent Irwin, Scotty Washington, and Riley Lees. But I truly think this wide receiver room is absolutely elite, and definitely helps them push this team up the rankings. So I do think that this is a huge strength for them, and they will probably have to rely on it quite a bit. Then the tight end room, not particularly great. Drew Sample, it was an okay pick when it first happened, but he has not necessarily done anything great yet. He has not stepped up to that next level. I do think this year could be the year he does that, but I just don't know about him being an elite target in this offense. So I don't feel great about Drew Sample being my starter. CJ Uzoma, I wouldn't want starting either, but he's a pretty good backup. I think he can be in the rotation, especially if Sample is not doing a whole lot for you. Then you can mix in Uzoma. He can be pretty good at blocking. So you have options at least there, but none of them are startable to me behind Drew Sample, because then you have Thaddeus Moss. You could also switch him with Mason Schreck. You could kind of pick between those two. I ended up going with Moss just because of the connection with Joe Burrow. We'll see. He dealt with some injury issues last year, didn't really get on the field for Washington. A smart idea, though, to me, for the Bengals to just bring him in, perhaps unlock some of that potential we saw at LSU. But I have him making it. You could, like I said, go with Mason Schreck, who I'm barely being cut. I almost put him on the practice squad. he has had some impact on special teams, so he could potentially make this team, so don't throw him out. Shane O'Grady perhaps could be a practice squad player. Behind him, I don't love Mitchell Wilcox or Pro Wells. But you have some options here, and they're all pretty young, but I haven't seen any of them take that next step, and you're hoping maybe a healthy Burrow could unlock the potential of at least one of these guys. Between Sample, we've kind of already seen what Uzoma is, but maybe he can get Thaddeus Moss to a good level again. Now let's look at the offensive line. Now this is an interesting room. Now it's been a joke that the offensive line for the Bengals is absolutely terrible. And it was not good last year. But honestly, looking at just the players themselves, it's not that bad. And yes, they did make some additions here. But honestly, not that much. You're really looking at only, 3-4 guys who are really new to the team, or at least didn't get many snaps last year. So I think it's actually a decent room now. And looking at what they could have done in the draft, right? I talked about the situation earlier. I mean, they have Jonah Williams, who I think is an underrated player at this point, as people forget that they picked him. He's dealt with some injury issues. So he is a solid left tackle, which is why I think it would have been weird. And I know we are seeing the Lions do this with Penei Sewell, kicking him over to right tackle. They also bring in Riley Reef before they even drafted anybody, and they were going to have him moved to right tackle probably anyways. So I think they kind of knew that Chase was going to be their guy going into the draft, and that's why they chose a guy like Jackson Carman in the second round. So overall, you're actually looking at a similar offensive line last year, but just gaining some guys back with a few additions. So let's really dive into what they're looking at here. So as I mentioned, Jonah Williams is a great left tackle. He is a sure thing. I think he is not quite fully developed, but he still can. Like I said, he's just dealt with some injury issues. When he is on the field, he plays very well, and I think could still end up being an elite tackle, kind of like an Andrew Whitworth was for this team for so long. And he is a sure thing at left tackle, which is why they have to move somebody over to right tackle. They've had some pretty terrible players between, I think, like Bobby Hart was their starting right tackle for a while. That was not great for them. Now, the thing is, too, anyways, though, Riley Reef, who has been decent for the Vikings, he is okay. He's a startable player. He's never going to be the best player on an offensive line at this point. And I don't love them moving him over to right tackle. But that's what they have to do, because I do like almost their whole bench is young and can develop. But I don't love them having to move Riley Reef over to right tackle. So you still kind of have a weakness there, but it is better than what they have had there before. But that is kind of a concern. Then I like Quentin Spain at right guard. I truly think that is a pretty good, solid player. He was great in Tennessee, was okay in Buffalo, but I think he is a startable player still at this point in his career. Then, as I mentioned, they picked Jackson Carman in the second round. I didn't love that choice. I personally think there were some better tackles or better guards either way, depending on what they were viewing it, because I think that, at least for right now, they'll play him at guard. They could eventually kick him back to tackle if Reef doesn't work out, or in a few years if he develops. But to start, I think they have him at guard, even though he did play mostly tackle at Clemson. I think same with when I talked about the Falcons playing Jalen Mayfield at guard. You're just looking to put your best 5 guys out there, and I do think Jackson Carman is that. And as I also mentioned before in previous episodes, it's not always bad for young tackles to go into guard. We've seen it work out many, many times before. So with that, you look actually okay. I like Jonah Williams a lot. Jackson Carman can develop. Don't love that right side, but it kind of balances out. And then let's talk about center. You're going to have a competition here. I gave it to Trey Hopkins just because I think he's performed better in the past few years and had the starting spot last year, but Billy Price still can compete. Billy Price does look like an absolute bust at this point in his career. Has not turned out very well. They picked him in like the top 20, and I think most people were shocked. You don't see centers that often go pretty early. I believe that was the same draft as Frank Ragnow too. I don't remember who went first. I think it was Ragnow, so it's not like you could. And he's played pretty well. But Billy Price has not done so. He was a backup last year for this team, and you're just maybe keeping him around because you spent a first-round pick on him. But I don't see them ever looking to extend him or anything like that. So he's kind of turned out to be a flunk from the first round. So you kind of have a little bit of a weakness there at center, but you're going to have a competition. Then the other depth players are mostly young guys who are insurance if this offensive line were to have something go down. For example, you have Hakeem Adeniji, who can play tackle and guard. Coming out of Kansas last year, he is a safe player. I don't think his upside is very high at all. I don't think he's ever going to be a startable player, in my opinion. If so, he's just kind of a borderline one. He is safe, though. That's why he's the perfect backup for this team, is where he could fill in for anybody because he can pretty much play tackle or guard. But he's never going to be a high-ceiling player. Xavier Su'a-Filo, I think, actually dealt with some injuries last year. You get him back. They bring him in over. He's been depth piece for a few teams, the Texans and the Cowboys. So he has actually proven to be a good insurance policy. Now they bring him in, hopefully, in case something were to happen, they have a decent backup. They also have Michael Jordan, a young player who has played relatively okay. I guess not great, but fine as a young player. As a guard, could play center as well. So another depth piece for insurance. And then they draft Deontay Smith, who I think, honestly, if Reef doesn't play well, could be a candidate for a starting right tackle spot. If not, in a year or two, I certainly think he could be. He was an underrated player to me coming out of East Carolina this year. So I think he can perform pretty well if needed. So overall, this offensive line is an improvement from where it was last year, and we certainly know that that is the biggest weakness for this team, for sure. And I do think it is improved. Not by a whole lot, though, just considering who they only bring in, like 3 new faces, perhaps. And so you're really just looking for that improvement of guys coming back from injury, perhaps some development. That's where you're looking to see the improvement. So it's honestly not a whole ton better than it was last year, but it is at least a little bit, and it's an improvement. So hopefully Joe Burrow can stay healthy with this better offensive line. Switching over to the defense, let's start with talking about their edge rushers, their pass rushers. Also, these are kind of their defensive ends as well, so they will have some ability to stop the run. But let's just first talk about probably their best player in this room, but Trey Hendrickson. I did not love this signing. I do think Trey Hendrickson is a good player. He has really only shown, about a year or two of elite play for the Saints, and they go out and give him a big contract, and they let go of Carl Lawson. And looking at the numbers, I think they made exactly the same salary per year on each contract, but Hendrickson, I think, got an extra year. So, in retrospect, in my opinion, if I had to choose between Trey Hendrickson and Carl Lawson, I would have chosen Carl Lawson. Now, I do think Hendrickson right now may be better, but I feel that Carl Lawson was still on the development side, and it could be an elite player for the Jets if given some time now. So I truly think it was a mistake. I don't think it was that bad. Like, at least you have a startable player, a number 1 pass rusher here. But I don't love it. I personally would have stuck with Carl Lawson for the same dollar amount, even if you had to give Lawson an extra year, because I just think he has higher upside. And that's what they seem to be going for here. So I don't love that, but Trey Hendrickson will do fine. Similar to what I've talked about with like a Dante Fowler type of player, Trey Flowers, that type of skill, where they're the number one pass rushers, but kind of borderline. They do have Sam Hubbard, who dealt with some injuries, so getting him back will be nice for them. He's proven to be a startable player, and I think he could still just go up from there. But right on his heels is Joseph Asai, who is almost closer to me to an outside linebacker. In my opinion, that's where you would be best fit because he's speedy. He is definitely a twitchy, finesse type of player. He did get obliterated by some of the stronger offensive tackles. I mean, specifically, if you turn on the Tevin Jenkins tape versus Joseph Asai, Asai did get dominated in that game. So he is not going to do well with power tackles, which to me is why you would want him as kind of a speed rusher. And that's what I think they're going to look to do with him here. Hendrickson and Hubbard are going to be more power guys, and I think that Asai can bring in maybe a third down level to this team that they need. They need some more speed here. And that's what Cam Sample can also bring. I like that pick out of Tulane. They took him in the 4th round. So those two could be the future, honestly, of their pass rush. I do like Sam Hubbard as well, but Joseph Asai to me is the intriguing one. He does, like I said, struggle against power tackles, but I think his upside is the highest of anybody in this group. And then Khalid Kareem, they took last year as well, I think in the 4th round, so they're going to keep him around just because of that draft capital, but if he doesn't play very well, they pick some replacements this year for him. I do have them keeping Wyatt Hubert, who they took in the 7th round out of Kansas State, and then Amani Bledsoe, who used to play for the Titans, but he did relatively well when he played for this team last year. I have them cutting Darius Hodge. But this is a decent edge room in its entirety. I don't love what it has at the top, and I would not be surprised if within a year or two, Osai is starting, and maybe even Sample. I just think that Hendrickson is a good player, but when you could have kept Carl Lawson for the same dollar amount, I personally would have gone with him. And then Sam Hubbard, you're just hoping to bounce back from that injury. So next, let's talk about their defensive line, their defensive tackles, and it's a decent room here. This is probably one of their bigger depth rooms on this entire defense. They start with DJ Reader, who has proven to be a very, very good player. They bring him in from Houston a few years ago. He has proven to be a successful guy who can rush the passer and stop the run relatively well. They also bring in Larry Ogunjobi from Cleveland, so that was a good pickup to me. Mike Daniels, I thought, actually still can play pretty well. He could potentially rush the passer a bit. They bring him in last year. I don't think he's a great player, though. He probably has the lowest upside of anybody on this roster, at least that I have staying on the roster, so he could be a cut candidate. So keep an eye on that one. But then behind him is where I want to talk about here, the upside of Tyler Shelvin, who is just a space blocker. He has incredible size. He's just going to take up blocks. An ideal nose tackle. Similar kind of to a Reader Ogunjobi a little bit, but probably a little bit more power and size. A little bit slower, though. So I do think that he could be a piece for this team. They also have Rennell Wren, who they took relatively high a few years ago. Has dealt with some injury issues, but he has probably one of the higher upsides in this room. So he could still develop relatively well. So overall, you're looking great here. Reader is probably a top 10, top 15 defensive tackle in the league. Ogunjobi is definitely startable. And then they picked Shelvin this year. So you do have a good rotation. On the practice squad, you have Josh Tupou, who could actually make it over Mike Daniels. He was a borderline roster player for me. I decided to keep, maybe more depth at other positions because I think 5 is plenty for a defensive line. But he opted out of last season. But before that, he was starting to show some development. And he is a veteran, so you could see him make the roster for sure. I also have them keeping Khalil McKenzie, who's like a converted guard. He played in a lot of games last year and played relatively well. So I have them keeping him. I do have them cutting Freedom Akeem Moladun. So this is a good defensive tackle room. For what it's worth, you have a variety of skill sets, and it is very good overall. So you can feel confident in this room for sure. So now let's jump to the linebackers. This is a probably maybe their biggest weakness right now on the team would be their linebacker position, but I love what they're doing with it, basically, is my perspective. It's all young guys, and so the upside of this room is very, very good. Within a few years, this could be an elite linebacker room. They bring in all young players. I liked Logan Wilson coming out of Wyoming, and I think he can definitely develop into a star linebacker. Can be a hard hitter, can cover relatively well, so I like him there. Jermaine Pratt has started to develop and can be a pretty good middle linebacker for this team. Good tackler. They also have Akeem Davis-Gaither, who they took out of Appalachian State in the 4th round last year. A relatively good player as well, startable. But if they rather would start Jordan Evans, they could as well. Evans has been more of a special teams player recently. His tackling, he racks up tackles, not particularly great if you remember that Le'Veon Bell play a few years ago, for example. So you're not looking great starter right now, like starting caliber-wise on this team. But I think that you're looking for development this year. Because you also have Marcus Bailey, who, another great pick out of Purdue, could be a startable player within a few years and can offer special teams ability right now. And then borderline roster, kind of practice squad level, I decided to keep Keandre Jones, who played in a few games last year for them. He, I think, is not quite ready to be an NFL player, but I wanted to keep 6 linebackers on this team, considering they don't have a lot of, starter players. Like, you're looking just, as long as you have as many young players, you might as well try out as many as possible. So I do like the upside of this group a lot. I think within a few years, this could be a great trio. But right now, it's not great. You also have Joe Bacci on the bench, who I have them cutting, borderline practice squad player. So they have a lot of young players. Jordan Evans is your most experienced player, and that's not necessarily great, but I do like the upside of this room. So although it may be a weakness right now, if any of these guys develop, you're looking at a pretty good room. Then corner. Corner is maybe their biggest depth position perhaps on this team, I would say, at least for who I have staying on the roster. They've gone with a very interesting approach when it comes to their corner room. They just, this year, threw some money on the table for it, and I'm all for it. It was obviously a huge loss to lose William Jackson, who really blossomed for this team and became a number 1 corner for them. But they did relatively well replacing with who they had. Now they bring in Chidobe Awuzie, which, in case you were wondering who that player is with the signed picture, that is who it is. He is okay. I think he never quite developed to what we thought of. I think a lot of people really liked him coming out of Colorado in that draft because he had the length, possibly the man coverage ability. He just hasn't shown it fully yet, but he at least has proven to be a startable player on this roster. I feel like he can be a borderline number 1 corner. I don't feel great about it, but as a startable player, he definitely is. And so he's still developing a bit. But perhaps the best signing and the best corner overall in this entire room might be Mike Hilton. Absolute stud in the slot. Great for Pittsburgh. I was surprised they let him go. I don't even think he got that big of a contract. Like, he got paid, but compared to some of these other corners, I think he was signed relatively late in free agency. So I truly think you can trust him to be your starting slot guy, and he's one of the best at it in the NFL. So that was an absolutely great pickup, in my opinion. Also, Trey Waynes, who they brought in last year, kind of struggled a bit, just didn't get on the field because of injuries and stuff. He's another player who maybe hasn't developed fully to what we expect. The Vikings took a shot on him, in 2015, and it just did not work out for him. He does have speed, but he's still struggling when it comes to coverage. They also have Darius Phillips, who has been a kind of a diamond in the rough. Did not, come out of Western Michigan as a very highly a rated prospect, but has really performed relatively well for this team and is a startable player for sure. So I actually feel pretty good about him if he needs to be in the rotation. And they also bring Eli Apple, who spent some time with the Panthers last year. He's bounced around a bit. Another kind of draft bust a little bit from the Giants. They had to get rid of him to the Saints, and then, he goes over to the Panthers. So he's bounced around a bit. So they're kind of going with this theme of, if we can develop these guys to what they truly were or truly are, then this is a good room. I mean, this might be their best depth room on this entire defense. But overall, it doesn't have the stars. But I think their depth is great. Tony Brown, I almost had making the roster. He's a startable player on defense. If needed for insurance, I wouldn't feel comfortable starting him regularly, but he did fill in relatively well last year when injuries came up. And then they just have a lot of depth pieces. Jalen Davis is probably the best out of that group, but just not a whole lot of experience there. So I do like this corner room. It hasn't developed fully yet, but I think with some time, it could be pretty good overall. So now let's talk about the safeties, where you have an absolute stud, and Jesse Bates has been underrated for so long in his career, and he's finally starting to get some recognition. Absolutely great player, one of the best safeties in the league. I would say without a doubt the best player on this defense. Absolute stud, can do everything for you, specifically in coverage, is an absolute beast. So I feel great about that. He's unbelievable. You also have Von Bell, who they brought in last year, performed relatively well, had some hard hits. So I think he's a hard hitter and can tackle relatively well. Great opposite to Jesse Bates, who's more of a coverage player. So they also bring in Ricardo Allen, who I still think is a startable player in this league. So it was a great pickup for them. Atlanta decides to let him go, so they go out and pick him up. So they have another guy in the rotation. I definitely like that a lot. So they have 3 startable safeties. And then they also have Brandon Wilson, who has done great things on the kick return and special teams, has gotten a little bit of playing time on defense, but more so has been great returning. So I do like this safety room a lot. A lot of great skill sets. You've got coverage, tackling, special teams. You also, I have them keeping Trayvon Henderson on the practice squad, and I have them cutting Kevon Frazier. So I like the safety room a lot. This is one of their strengths for sure. Like I said, variety of skill sets, great players. This is just an elite room. So let's quick talk about their special teams, which is not particularly great just because of their inexperience at kicker. But it's not bad at all for sure. Like Kevin Huber at one point was a Pro Bowl punter, so he's a pretty good punter. Clark Harris is fine at long snapper. They do have this kicking competition between McPherson and Austin Siebert. You could go with either. I just feel that they spent like a 5th round pick on a kicker, which I never suggest doing. But if you're going to do it, you probably want to keep him on the team because I do think another team would take a shot on him. If so I have them keeping McPherson, but Siebert could be the starter. But if so, I'm keeping him on the practice squad just because I think you'd want 2 kickers here, but just because of the inexperience and you want some competition. And then Drew Chrisman is a backup long snapper, so he won't make the team. So let's talk about the schedule prediction. This team overall has, I think, the highest upside, and I started to talk about this where we would have situations where the record would go down but the ranking would go up, because I had the Falcons at 5 wins, and then I had the Lions at 4, and now I have the Bengals at 4 again. So if I were to go back out of these teams, I think the Bengals are a mile ahead of either of the other two. I think their ceiling, I mean, the Falcons could be close ceiling wise. I do think that base and ceiling, though, the Bengals are the best. I think the Lions had a better floor, like a better overall roster than the Falcons, but their upside is not as high. This team kind of has both, but the problem with the Bengals here is their schedule. Overall, they play in perhaps the toughest division, one of them. Probably the NFC West is probably the toughest, but the AFC North is also up there. where you have three teams who are playoff teams, if not borderline, like very, very close. And I just don't think the Bengals are quite ready to take that full step up. So it overall comes down to that. If they were in, for example, if this was an NFC East team, this is a 6-7 win team. But because of how tough of a schedule, I only have them at 4 wins. But don't get me wrong here, the Bengals are going somewhere. They have potential. They actually, have a chance of doing something within a few years. They have upside. So they start with some NFC North opponents with the Vikings and the Bears. I have them splitting that. And another reminder, if you are new to this series, I do what's called 50-50 games for games that are relatively close. Because as well, I started this series almost 2 months ago at this point. So it kind of, things can change as the series goes on. We're even looking at player situations like Deshaun Watson and Aaron Rodgers still to happen. So things can change consistently. So I kind of put these 50s in place to say that these games are close and it could go either way. And the color goes with the other game related to that color. And I'll also put automatic wins if we ever get to this point. But we haven't gotten to teams yet that are, miles ahead of other teams. But going back to the schedule, like I said, once you get to like the Steelers, their division opponents are very, very tough. You play the Jaguars here, winnable game. The Packers, if they don't have Aaron Rodgers, that would be my other 50. I needed an even amount of 50, so I would split that with the Steelers. Was my other barely. So I feel like that could be a winnable game if they don't have Aaron Rodgers, but if they do, it's an L for me. I think the Lions, I revealed them already. I think that's a winnable game. The Ravens, like I said, just a tough division with the Ravens, the Browns, and the Steelers. Jets are winnable game. Raiders, both of them I've revealed. A decent bye week as well. As I mentioned in the last one, I do like middle bye weeks, maybe late. You want close, definitely better than early. I personally would probably want late or middle because I want teams kind of starting. If they're on fire, I want them to get some rest before the playoffs. Now, the thing about that, though, too, is, then maybe if you're on a hot streak, you might start to lose it. So to me, a middle bye week is great because if you're struggling, you get a rest, and then you can, if you start getting on fire towards the playoffs, you can start to build that. But then it just, unfortunately, if they did have a shot at the playoffs, it kind of gets eliminated once you get to this tough stretch here between the Chargers, the 49ers, both are going to be playoff team potential. The Broncos still are good, even though they have a little bit of a questionable quarterback situation. And then to close it out with the Ravens, the Chiefs, and the Browns. Man, that's just rough. So I've been losing 5 of their last 6 games. That's just a struggle. This schedule is the reason they are so low with the record. Like I said, I rank the teams based on the roster, but the schedule, unfortunately, just doesn't give them justice to the potential of this team. So let's talk about the awards I'm giving out. I'm giving Joe Burrow the Offensive Player of the Year. I just think he is going to have a great bounce-back year. He's going to be an elite player, and within a few years, he could be an MVP-level player. So I think he is an absolutely great quarterback and can make some great plays and can lead this team to a good season if needed. And then I have Jesse Bates as my Defensive Player of the Year. As I mentioned, he's an absolute stud, a great safety, one of the best. And so he, overall, is a leader on this defense and will need to be. Then you have Logan Wilson as my breakout player of the year. It was, I'd say, like between him, you could maybe say Sam Hubbard as well. Someone like they're an offensive lineman perhaps. T. Higgins was maybe my other choice. Or Drew Sample at tight end. Like you have a lot of options of guys who are looking to step up. But I decided just because T. Higgins is kind of already a breakout, he did pretty well last year as a rookie, I like to talk about these underrated players. So I feel like Logan Wilson this year can prove that he is a startable, maybe even a top 32, like number 1 linebacker. So that's my breakout player for them. I have Jamar Chase clearly being the rookie of the year. He's going to be elite this year. As I said, I may have not had him as a number 1 receiver in the draft, but for this team, he's the best fit. And so I think he's going to do great. So thank you so much for watching this video. We're getting farther and farther with the rankings. More content to be coming out soon. And I'm also going to start mixing in. Eventually, I'm figuring out I want to finish this series with NFL content. But I have a few ideas for some college football content. And as last year, I will probably bring in the film breakdowns a little earlier than I did last year. So for next year's draft already. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. And I will see you in the next one.